So I just finished up Atomfall, which was kind of the new Game Pass RPG that was dropped out there. I know it's available in other places, but I played it through Game Pass because I already have it. I thought free was about the right price for what I wanted to enjoy there. And overall, it's kind of a confusing game because it's from a decent sized studio. I would say at least 100 plus people worked on it, and like, the story is the only thing that I didn't feel like was made by committee. Um, it just there was a lot of stuff that just clearly, at least to me, I feel like somebody said, "What are the tropes? What tropes do we need to fit for this genre of game? Okay, crafting, we okay, better do that. Going around exploring and collecting things, okay, we better do that." And it was, eh, like, I don't know, it wasn't bad. It's just kind of a shame that it's one of the better, uh, offerings of that kinda game type, considering what has been coming out lately. And then the other thing that I've been playing, I actually just finished up, because I noticed that I hadn't touched it since it came out of early access back in, like, 2019, is a little indie game called Crying Suns, and that is a funny juxtaposition in the sense that it's a much simpler game mechanically, but the whole thing, uh, you know, at least was aligned around a single thematic vision of this very bleak, post-apocalyptic, distant future experience. And again, I took a little issue with the story ending, but overall, I would actually say I feel like that one provided more gameplay and certainly more interesting gameplay at that kind of price point. You look at the two, it's this is like a $25 indie game versus a $40 double A game, and I think that's a real challenge that a lot of the gaming sphere is currently wrestling with.
Yeah, no, that's kind of the thing that because one, like many other areas of study, shall we say, I've been very much kind of digging more into a lot of old school titles. Um, Something that I probably should have been on years ago, but I didn't even like know existed until like a couple, probably last year is when I found out about it. Was Full Throttle, a LucasArts title,
Mhm.
and I'm like, bikers, conspiracies, the fucking sweet, sweet adventure game logic. Sign me the hell up, basically. But it's kind of sitting on like my TBG to be gamed list with like a half dozen other things. Cause
Yeah,
I will completely cop to I do not have my gamer card. I did not get my license updated. It lapsed severely from my days of playing only the finest consoles, like a Jack specific plug and play.
yeah.
Real talk. That is actually my first ever game of anything ever. Was Power Rangers SPD as like a
Interesting.
Jack specific plug and play. So you have like the racing elements, you have some of the platform fighting elements. I remember vividly when they all team up to form the mech at the end, and that's kind of like the end boss of whoever you're playing as. And I remember vividly the way they rendered it. I'm like, okay, this has got some. This is like giving me the Nam flashbacks to like Donkey Kong Country and the way they rendered the CGI sprites for that.
Mhm.
And I mean, I could also be off. It could also just be like kind of the 4-year-old brain imagining this hyper lavish game where if I actually plugged it in today, I'd be like, God damn, what the hell was I smoking as a kid? No, but I've been
Yeah.
having this kind of growing list of titles I just need to sit down and just kind of play end to end because I'm more of an adventure game guy. I love I started and I still need to finish. I love Blade Runner, Westwood's Blade Runner. I love everything about it. I love the pre-rendered backgrounds. I love the brilliant recreations of the Vangelis score by I believe the guy who did the music for Command and Conquer. if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
Um,
I also would love to pick that one up. That's
it
there's such a huge backlog of
There is. It's
gaming. I mean,
insane.
and I think one of the struggles that gaming that is unique to gaming in a way is that yes, obviously everything has a huge backlog whenever you come to media, but
No, 100%.
gaming has an interesting two interesting concerns. One of them is the amount of time it actually takes to play some of these games. Uh, just from a skill standpoint, old games were much more brutal. And then the other one is the preservation standpoint. You can't even experience some of these as they were originally intended. Uh, and you do have emulators, obviously, but it's still not the
Yeah, yeah.
same.
It's not the same as the CRT. It's not the same as actually working with the console itself.
Hmm.
And that's kind of one of the, because I know the retro market has been absolutely, screwed 7 ways to Sunday. Like before
Yeah.
I even was even able to collect anything. But like the main dream, even if it has to be like, people like basically duping cartridges or whatever, like my
Hmm.
big dream is just at least getting a Sega Genesis and at least collecting a good handful of titles, because one of the things I actually was able to get was that Sega Genesis Mega Drive collection thing on Steam, where they sell like individual games for like the price of like a song on iTunes.
Hmm.
And I got, a couple of things. First three Sonics, I believe the first two Streets of Rage games, which those, oh my god, those
Yeah.
absolutely just, if I ever need to like unwind, just unravel the absolute spaghetti knots that is my brain on any given day, which is a weird metaphor, but we're gonna run with it anyway. But like just this complete mess up in the cranium, literally just hammering out rounds in the Streets of Rage has always been like the better than therapy. Guys will do literally anything but go to therapy. That includes playing
Yeah.
Streets of Rage. But the funny thing about the time sync issue too is that it is so unique to this particular medium, beyond say like YouTube like feature length 2 to 3 hour like retrospectives or like
Mhm.
multi-hour podcasts. Gaming is like the only like narrative medium that people will be like, no, I don't want to watch a 3 hour movie. No, I don't want to, watch this, mammoth miniseries. But I'll
Yeah.
game for like 6 hours a day. And I
Yeah.
don't even say that to be like, the hypocrisy, but it's just like it's literally just the nature of the medium. If you get
Hmm.
into it, you get into it. And if you're immersed, time does not exist. You'll literally look up from the computer and realize, oh my god, it's midnight. How the hell did this happen?
Yes,
And
absolutely. And I think, I mean, I think that's one of the defining factors of gaming is the ability to sort of extract you more fully in some degree. I mean, don't get me wrong, you can get lost in movies or books and things like that as well. But yeah, the immersion factor is something that I think, and also it's not even necessarily just immersion. Sometimes that's the case. I think it's just a matter of how much of your brain can be engaged in the activity, and the I don't know. Good games always nail a particular uh, button. You know what I mean? Within your brain, they find something to jump on and get you going for just a little bit longer.
no, 100%. And my philosophy has always been that movies, even in like the world of like, meta humor or whatever, movies still objectively have the fourth wall. There is
Yeah.
still, the audience is watching. They're not playing the movie, they're not, personally manipulating the movie. It's not like an interactive thing like with, because Netflix had a couple of months ago officially closed down their like interactive like games division. And so a
Hmm.
bunch of these interactive episodes of their shows, including I think Black Mirror,
Huh.
famously had a big episode. I think it was called Bandersnatch. that was a completely like a choose your own like branching path take on an episode.
Interesting. I had not heard of that.
Yeah, no, and it's like the idea of the interactive movie does go back to even like, the 90s where you have designers like Ken Gieno making stuff such as like D, which literally is full motion video as like these little junction points where it loops, you pick a direction, file plays, static, pick a direction, and kind of going through like that. So it's like interactive movies have always been there, but it's like movies in and of themselves have always been kind of a different, have always been engaged with innately differently from games. And it seems like one of those like no duh things. Like people would be like, yeah, no, of course they engage with it differently. But it's like that's kind of the key thing, is that because you're actively interacting with it, or even just casually, like even if you just find yourself getting into that loop. Like I know like one of the reasons why live service games like PvP arenas have always kind of, kept people locked in for almost like 12 hours at a time is because once you get into that loop, you're there and you're
Hmm.
just going round after round after round. Like you're going to be like the next freaking esports star. Like you're literally just, you are locked in. Um But yeah, so it's like there's always been that sort of, there's the fourth wall with movies, but with games there is no fourth wall. You're always in there, you're always engaged in the game in some manner. And I think that also is kind of what leads to the interesting, kind of conundrums that certain, titles and developers find themselves in. I was talking with a friend the other day, and we're kind of going over the question of like, are video games art? And it's like I look at it the same way that certain like popular cinemas art at the way comic books are art. It's popular art, it's not high art, we're not hanging it in the Louvre, but there is an artistry and there's all these interlocking mediums at play. There's the art of music, there's the art of performance, there's the art of design, both in terms
Hmm.
of art design, in terms of level design, in terms of concept and character design. Um, but because of that interactive element, it's kind of, there's almost this next level of investment that you might not even find in film or in other mediums, because you're basically there, you're identifying with
Yeah.
the character you're playing as you go through. So it's like,
Well, and also there's just more there's more widgets
oh,
and things going
absolutely.
on, you know.
There
And
are
so
there are more doodads.
yeah, and so in certain cases you might be able to um emphasize an emotion by using a certain game mechanic or a certain difficulty of something. And I think that that's that participatory nature of gaming is one of the things that it's like that's its greatest strength, but I also think it keeps it, I would say, out of something like the fine art category. um, I, I am inclined to say that broadly speaking things like fine art are uh, meant to be consumed in a kind of um, group setting. There's a major social component to it, and
There's a
so
yeah,
you
there's going to the gallery or going to the opera house, or yeah, no, I totally agree with that.
exactly, or having a book, maybe not necessarily. I know a book club is probably the most pedestrian way to describe it, but you go to uh, a university and you debate about the meanings and the thoughts put forth by various things.
Right,
You
right.
study literary works. Each case, the art itself, or the piece of work, shall we say, that's being considered as fine art, it, that is sort of a consensus agreement, and frankly, a part of that consensus was derived through the group experience of discussing that. You need to have a certain, like a really profound painting will evoke commentary and emotion from a variety of people, and you all go and you say, well, this is sort of what it made me feel. And it's that discussion that happens as a result of the piece of art that um that I would say elevates it. And can that be the case with gaming? I think it can. I just think that it is in many ways um contrary to the nature of that sort of discussion. Now maybe, you know, I would say once upon a time it probably was fair to say something like reading, you would have debate, but reading itself, going off and studying the pages of something, if not everybody could read, that was a very different sort of experience. And we're kind of at a point where gaming is has gone through its Gutenberg press phase. Everybody can game now, thanks to the technology changing and to some degree degrading, but expanding outward. But
Right, right.
nobody's taken that and put forth an experience that is really palatable to people to play all the way through. I think it's there, and I think maybe in retrospective there'll be some gems that are thought of as kind of like canonical, in the same way you can argue about the canon of various um, genres and things like that, literary genres. But anyway, I digress.
Well,
It,
I think the interesting thing there, because one of the things that I'd kind of mentioned with him because of the interactive element is that I'd say probably the greatest the best designed and the best realized titles can basically take you on a wholly unique story, and can
mhm.
only do so in the way only games can. Like the way I told him is, I think the reason why something like Silent Hill 2 is kind of forever revered as this Titanic classic. And hats off to Bloober Team. Not gonna lie, it is a genuine surprise to see their remake see the success that it's been seeing.
Yeah.
Because it's like it almost, the idea remake Silent Hill 2, it sounds heretical. Like, it absolutely sounds heretical, but at the same time, Capcom's been, really hitting the ground running with remaking the Resident Evil series. But on the flip side, you can still see that the atmosphere of the original title back in, good grief, 2001, everyone run for the hills, we're getting old. It's like
No comment. No comment.
love it. But it's like, what makes a title like that work so well is that even though it takes you on a very sobering, very dark, emotionally, psychologically, just a very dark, kind of almost kind of a tragic arc. There's enough in there in terms of atmosphere, in terms of pure immersion, like with all the sound design
Hmm.
elements, the radio static, the brilliant Akira Yamaoka's score. You basically are able to kind of identify with some of the commonalities of kind of James Sunderland. You find a little bit of yourself in him, even when the big reveal happens, and you're just kind of sinking into your chair, leaned back, just like, oh my god.
Yeah. Well, and I
You know,
think I think that one of the big factors to consider is that the real power of games, or at least the most obvious direction along these lines to me, is the ability to get the reader, or not the reader, but the what would you call it, the consumer, the person who's experiencing the work,
no,
to
let's keep it
make the
simple. The
same
player.
decisions. Yeah,
Yeah.
make the same decisions that you would sort of want the character to take to a certain degree. And so I think for
Right.
that reason, it's it's easiest to point at these narrative focused single player linear, relatively linear games as being the most like art. If
Yeah.
if you want you read in a book and someone is forced to choose between, saving themselves and uh, killing a friend or letting a friend die or something like that. In the book, you might say, you can understand the turmoil within the character and everything else. If a game sets you up for that moment and then gets you authentically without, uh, toying around with the boundaries of what the game allows, but
Right.
authentically allows you or gets you to make those same decisions on your own. I would say a decidedly different experience, and it's where gaming can shine in particular.
Yeah.
But
And I do.
you still run into all of the and one issue with that, I think, if you don't mind me derailing slightly back,
Oh, go for it. Go for it.
is that you know games used to be much more concerned about story. I feel like, and I think that as modern gaming TM has moved more and more into the graphical fidelity and oh wow, look what we can do. It was good popular art advertising, like it was a good way to get out to the masses and appeal to people, but it got away from some of the core things that had been developed and were growing within the medium. So you had early, the very earliest games, there was no narrative at all. It's not like you're telling a story with Pong or Asteroids or even, there's not much in the way of story in the original Mario and Zelda implementations, for example. But as the medium began to allow and sort of had more of an audience, uh, they were able to set themselves apart by not only developing new game mechanics, but also implementing good storytelling and these other things that were, the pillars of other mediums, like movie or print. And
It's
so, yeah, I think that there's to kind of bring it around. I think that there's been a lot of, I'll just broadly call it, research and development. People have literally been building not just the tech behind the medium, but the medium itself has been uh, out there prototyping things since its inception. We really haven't stopped. So there's a few like solved games, you know what I mean? But by and large, uh, things are still being experimented with and tried at a very base level that you don't see with other mediums as much.
Well, the funny thing is, going back to the whole, our video games art question, is that gaming is unique in that it still suffers from the kind of insecurity that Western comic books, specifically like Western superhero comics, kind of suffer from. The idea that, oh, it's kiddie fair, oh, it's only for X, Y, and Z. And in comics, kind of the big breakthrough for I'd say the West is, one, you at least had titles like Heavy Metal Magazine spicing up the spinner racks and
Hmm.
the newsstands. But on the flip side, then you actually have the big two, Marvel, DC, and a host of other smaller houses later on in the 90s, then doing all these wildly different things. Like I think Marvel had Epic Illustrated. I can't remember. Is Vertigo DC?
I don't remember.
Yeah. Point is, you kind of have this proliferation of, well, even then, if we're not talking labels, DC still wound up with Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns. So it's like they still wound up with kind of having their watershed radical re-envisionings of, kind of what the superhero is. And so whatever, people can make of the state of comics nowadays, I mean, especially with what's happened to the big two, unfortunately, there is
Hmm.
still, at least, you still get the sense that the medium itself isn't constantly pining for credibility anymore, especially now that we kind of have this sort of this globalized age where we have slightly better access than we used to the fruits of bande dessinée over in France, or obviously the explosion of manga. Whereas with gaming, it's kind of strange where it's almost like you can point to all these historic titles throughout the years, and yet there still feels like, people still feel like there is that, you know, oh, we're still not, good enough, even though gaming is like objectively bigger than Hollywood. It's been bigger by kissing a decade now. It is, if not hundreds of millions, billions ahead of where the movie industry is. And yet still there's that
Yeah,
there
but I think the big problem, one of the big problems though with that gaming, to lend some credence to the identity crisis or the inadequacy that they're feeling, is that you look at that money and, like, okay, who are the big drivers for, historically, who were the big drivers for Hollywood? Back before it was the Minecraft movie, which is its own kind of irony. Um, you had things like, you had Terminator and basically all these iconic films coming out in the 80s and 90s and even early 2000s. The big things were not, um, maybe they weren't the most highest form of art. They weren't art house films, but they at least were somewhat elevated within the medium. Now you look and what's the highest, I fear to look at what the highest grossing game is. It's probably, some Farmville exploitation thing.
right.
It's a lot of gaming is buoyed up by the lowest rung, um, of the lowest rung possible of the medium. And so I think that people striving to try and improve and elevate the medium, I understand what they're doing. I don't generally like those types of games because I think that they're, frankly, I think a lot of those people look at movies and think that if they could only make a game that was like a movie, that
I
they
th-
would
I th-
win.
I've definitely heard that, like, in a lot of like my research, just kind of, going over different, like, people's kind of like misgivings with the current state of like the AAA industry. And a lot of it is, people are really peeved with the idea of games, basically people who want to make movies but are making games. And basically it's like, I like to call some of these art stunts, where it's basically you do something that, makes you radically reconsider what the title is, but unfortunately it doesn't always stick its landing, purely because of what I think is the one thing that might, that kind of keeps gaming away from ever being kind of in the upper echelons or even close to kind of the idea of fine art. Like, I would actually go to bat and say that even the most avant-garde experience in video gaming, like, even if it's like a digital installate, like almost you'd call like a digital installation, I would not even consider that, I would still consider that popular art. I think by virtue of the interactivity and by virtue of how important the audience is to gaming, because it's not just, oh no, we need to sell more tickets. It's, oh no, these are the people with the controllers in their hands, engage with your experience and engaging with it for literal days worth of time.
Hmm.
Because what, people will sink, what, 20, 40 hours into completing a campaign. Or,
Easily, yeah,
yeah,
easily.
absolutely. And, it's like, I think one of the great examples of kind of like the art stunt is sort of the killing of Joel in Last of Us Part 2, because it's like, as, if you're looking at it from a purely abstracted, you know, created, just looking at it just creatively, it is a bit of a power play, just to
Hmm.
be willing to do something that audacious. But at the same
Well,
time, play well no
yeah,
just to make the
yeah.
point,
Go ahead.
it's audacious, it's an audacious thing to do in abstract, when the reality is that literally these people have been playing with this character, have been relating, identifying with this character for an entire game prior. Like, no wonder people would be absolutely losing their gourds over what then happens in Last of Us Part 2, because it's like, literally, it's not just like in a movie franchise where it's like, all of a sudden you have a shock death. Like, something like Star Trek The Wrath of Khan can stick the landing of Spock's death because it not only feels earned, but it also comes at it comes at the climax. It's a sacrifice that the character then makes to basically save the ship. Versus what happens here in that it's like what it comes in like the first third, and then you have this completely different experience going into the rest of the title, and of course a different set of characters and a different set of creative interests from Neil Druckmann and everyone at Naughty Dog, and it's just kind of like films can kind of get away with this shit because it's tactical, but also it's within the confines of a, cut off narrative experience. The movie has a start point, an end point, usually doesn't go longer than 2 hours.
Yes.
You just robbed people of someone they spent literal, like, probably weeks of their life with in, like, a parasocial nature. Like, no wonder that got raked through the coals, on top of everything else people have taken umbrage with.
Mhm. Well, and I think so. This kind of goes towards some of my feelings about fiction as well, like literary fiction, in the sense that I'm willing to tolerate a lot of like nihilism and rug pulls and other things that I don't know. A lot of people in the Iron Age would say, I don't like that, whenever it comes to short fiction, because I'm sitting down, you've got 15 minutes, 30 minutes tops of my time. And if you can do something in a way that is interesting, I don't mind you not necessarily wasting 15 minutes of my time, but, making a point that I didn't think you were going to make. Harrison Bergeron, for example, is an excellent, it's my favorite dystopian fiction piece because I don't have to spend, a couple of hours going through, oh, it's so awful, everything's so bad. You know, uh, uh, Kurt Vonnegut hammers you in the face with how things are, shows you the point of what he's trying to get at, and then pulls the rug out from under you to make his point. And it's all wrapped up in like 3,000 words or less. And so I think that you can do these things, like you were saying, with gaming, but just in a different setting. There was a little indie game that I played called Demonology, and it's where you play as a kind of like a witch finder and inquisitor back in the Middle Ages.
Mm.
And spoiler, he sets the game up in such a way that there's a bunch of extremely suspicious and kind of not great people in this little village, but each one of them has something strange about them, and you are supposed to torture them to figure out which one is the witch. And none of them are the witch. You just torture people. And the like, I get what he was getting at. I wish that I could have chosen to not torture people because literally the only way to pass the day is by torturing people. So that's a bit much, but I got what he was getting at. All grand total, the game took me like 45 minutes to get through. And so if you want to do these kinds of, like you were saying, like the art house thing, I think it can be done in gaming. It just needs to be done with an understanding of the medium, with a respect for people's time as well.
Well, I think that
Yeah.
the funny thing too with that particular example is that when I immediately heard Witchfinder General, my immediate thought was the actual film itself with Vincent Price, which was a kind of a fictionalized take on a real Witchfinder General of the time,
Hmm.
Matthew Hopkins, and that film does not pull its punches on how sadistic that
Yeah.
particular vein of the character is. It's one of Price's most terrifying performances, which is saying something considering how he's kind of the one of the kind of modern godfathers of the classic creepy horror actor.
Mm.
Um, and I'm not gonna lie, that send me the link to that later on because I'm curious about how that kind of plays within the confines of an interactive experience. Even if even with it quote unquote spoiled for me,
Hmm.
because
Yeah, there are things to find out. There are mysteries to solve. within the
Yeah.
game. So it's it's something that I think like I said, it's an interesting experience, and I don't object to it because it didn't try to drag me
Right.
through 10 hours of campaign where I get
Right.
closer and closer to whatever, and then what do you know? You're the monster all along. Wow, thank you, game. Wow, what a revolutionary idea.
And it's funny too because the arch factor there is just having respect for the audience's intelligence. That is what makes the Silent Hill games brilliant. Is that there is actual subtext to uncover. No, it's not like Masahiro Ito has like a giant arrow pointing down at Pyramid Head saying, that's your repressed sexuality, James. That's your repressed male rage, James. Like, you are
Yeah.
allowed to actually take in the actions. You're allowed to take in what's happening in the cutscenes. You're allowed to just take in the atmosphere. You're allowed to read into the riddles of the puzzle, the ephemera littered throughout the town. And also, you're able to take it in on like an illusionary basis. Like, you're actually able to spot the aesthetic and conceptual references being made throughout the title. Like, a great example is that scene where Sunderland first encounters Pyramid Head is a flagrant allusion to Kyle MacLachlan hiding in the closet in Blue Velvet, where he first sees Dennis Hopper and Isabella Rossellini and their sordid affair. And so you can actually read into it on those various levels, but none of it's telegraphed. There
Hmm.
isn't like an MST3K annotation popping up on your screen saying, "Did you know?" And it's like they allow you to absorb it naturally and then reflect on it in retrospect. All right,
Yeah.
watch me filter everyone when I say this, but I do believe in experiencing not just, things outside of your comfort zone. I explicitly believe in experiencing experimental, whether it's modernist, postmodernist, whatever art, because I think simply for the fact that you're able to explore different elements of a craft that you otherwise wouldn't within conventional genre entertainment or even the classical definitions of the fine arts, the formal the formal portrait, the structure of a symphony, stuff like that.
Hmm.
Because simply it's one, if you find something you like, you find something you like. And you shouldn't have this chip on your shoulder about, oh no, Mrs. Parmington forced me to read this in school. Yuck. For like the rest of your life, although I know that's kind of the unfortunate truth about, kind of, what happens for people in like an English class or whatever. But genuinely, I have found some of my favorite ideas have been just in experiencing experimental work. Like, what are some of our favorite boogeymen around here? Dramatic literary fiction, abstract expressionism. If I could, I would hang a Rothko in my house this instant, just to mess with people. I will proudly parade my choice of Jackson Pollock splatter. Uh, but it's like,
Hmm.
and I say it half jokingly, but I do seriously believe in being able to engaging with these works because they're how you experience different elements of what makes great work. Like, I think the thing about abstract expressionism is that you're allowed to look into it. You're not just supposed to just stare blankly at it and be like, it means nothing, move on. You're allowed to be like, okay, what's this red doing to me? What's this shade of red doing to me? Or what's this
Yeah.
texture doing
I
to
mean,
me?
I think
Well,
that to push back slightly, I'll say that I think that I don't know. I would say understand, and I would say yes, understand, experience. And I think that you're also welcome to have your, to some degree, of course, your personal preference, but yeah, at least give it a whirl and
Well, yeah, and
check it out.
my point though is that I also don't expect these things to all work within the confines of gaming.
Hmm. Yeah.
That's my broader point, is that I don't expect these to work within the confines of gaming. I think they can work in their respective, mediums of choice. But there is innately gaming is innately a populist form of art
Hmm.
because it is so reliant upon the audience's engagement. Not just, the idea of, what is the audience bringing to this? What knowledge are they bringing to this experience? What past interest? Are they familiar with the director? Are they familiar with the source material? This, that, or the other. Gaming is literally you're in it. You
Yeah.
are, in many cases, in it to win it. You are
Yeah.
actively invested in seeing this work through. Like if you're not if you're being turned off by this, guess what? You get to turn off the dang game. Like, there is no one forcing you. It isn't like obviously no one's forcing you to do anything. You can walk out of the theater, you can stop listening to the album midway if you think it all stinks. But it's like, gaming is a unique, kind of beast in that it is an like you said earlier, it's an actively participatory medium. And
And
because it is, there is a certain level of gratification to be expected. And it doesn't mean gratification as in, the old arcade sense of bigger, better scorer, or whatever. It means having that full, fulfilling experience. Because here's the thing, Silent Hill in anyone else's hands would be that postmodern piece of trash everyone bashes on for being, oh, so
hmm
avant-garde
hmm
and experimental. But the reality is, it is realized by an incredibly competent team with an incredible sense of creative vision and a dedication to that creative vision, and most importantly, a respect for the audience who is about to experience it. So not only are they able to do such challenging themes and creative ideas, but they're able to do it without turning the audience off, even to the final terrible realization of, why Mary's in Silent Hill, or what you're doing to,
hmm
or why you're going to visit her there, and the realization of what actually happened. It
Yeah.
still feels fulfilling, at least in knowing the truth and uncovering the truth and understanding the truth in that
hmm
regard. And that's what makes a title like it so rich and so rewarding. Whereas, the sudden pivot in Last of Us 2 literally chopped the fan base in half.
Yeah. Well, and I would also say that a unique thing with gaming is that you're able to, as the participant, subvert the original goals of the designers to a certain degree, even with continued participation. So if you're taken out of it, I'll go back to Atom Fall, and I think I made the comment that it felt like everything except the story was made by committee, and I really have no interest in playing a game like that. Well, a common thing that you'll find among gamers is ways to exploit certain parts of the game and break things, but usually that occurs. There's not a big interest in speed running Silent Hill 2, for example. I'm sure somebody's done it just because they can, but uh, there's whenever you lose the audience with a movie or a book, you just stop participating in it. You take yourself out of it, you stop experiencing it. With gaming, like in Atomfall, I was curious. They built up this thing called Oberon, and I wanted to see what it looked like. I knew vaguely what it was, but I wanted to see what their portrayal of it was. And uh, the entire last section of the game, I just went, "Oh man, this is all this gameplay is incredibly tedious." And I figured out a way to just sprint past every enemy, uh, jump over some stuff so that they couldn't figure out how to navigate around it. And then uh, I discovered that you could just crouch in front of the hardest melee enemies in the game because they hadn't checked their hitboxes to make sure that they hit you, and I could just then whittle away at them at my leisure with a melee weapon. And so, I was like, I'm curious about the story, but I guarantee you that the experience they envisioned me having did not occur because all of those pieces weren't working together. And yet, I'll say, yeah, I actually experienced that game. You know, Like I
Right,
experienced the
right.
story, and so that's that's sort of the double-edged sword of the medium, and it's well, to kind of shift gears here, I think that one of the big problems that gaming has had is that because it's so it involves so much involvement from the audience, people are able to do so much more wish casting and project ideas and thoughts onto what they think something will be. And that's why you have a well, there's really two phenomenon that I want to talk about. Uh, if you don't mind me pivoting here,
Oh, go for it.
is that you have the pre-order boom bust phenomenon that occurred. A lot of people are now tired of early access because they sell you a dream, people see themselves in that dream, and or they see something amazing, and then you fail to deliver on that. Star Citizen being the most notable of these. But then another phenomenon that is happening right now is that games are telegraphing all the wrong things and then acting shocked when uh, gamers see this and are calling out what they're telegraphing and saying, "Oh, well, this is going to be bad." And then people are trying to say, "Well, how can you tell if it's bad? You haven't even played it yet." And in this case, the big offender is Marathon, which is a new game that is being made by a pretty previously well respected developer, Bungie. Made the iconic Halo series, and there's a lot of minutia to why I think it's not going to be well. Not least of all that they're hopping on to an extraction shooter trend, which I mean, I think I bought Escape from Tarkov in something like 2013. It's over
Good
10 years
grief, it's
ago
that
that
old. I
it's
didn't
very
even
old.
realize. Oh my
I have a
gosh.
huge beef with Escape from Tarkov because they basically got addicted to money, and they've also lied extensively about all sorts of things, especially their
Just snorting the good stuff with rolled up dollar bills.
yeah they
Good
for
gosh.
like 5 years they had screwed up their audio system, and it's because they weren't allowed to shoot real guns. They were shooting blanks, and they were anyway, it was just a lot of goofiness. And then their anti-cheat system for a very long time was horrendous, and they said it was because they were so good. But then on Russian television where they're from, they would admit that, well, actually a huge amount of our income is from key resellers, so it's important for us to basically allow cheaters to keep buying additional keys. um and so anyway, but I digress.
Incentivized scalping is a
it
is a new one. Good
Yeah,
grief.
it's scalping plus cheating. It was crazy. um but yeah, so it was anyway, I'm totally off on a tangent there. But Marathon comes in 10 years after the extraction shooter really popped off. I feel like, and certainly like 5 years after it hit mainstream consciousness, and it has the sort of blobby androgynous people that look like they're cut from Concord, which was an enormous miscalculation by Sony. And people are saying, "Oh my goodness, I like how are you writing this off when you haven't played it yet?" Well, you're telegraphing all the wrong things. You're setting us up. You're setting our expectations up to think that this looks like a schizophrenic corpo amalgamation of Fortnite, um, various brightly colored DEI, uh, you know, uh, what would you call it? Like placeholders or placations, and then
Like
an
ten,
outdated.
like stock models. You're just waiting to walk into an arena and see
No,
everyone
but yeah,
T posing.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like they took stock models and then threw as much junk on them as possible. It's over designed on purpose. I get it, but it just it doesn't look good. Um, and then it's being dropped into um, a game a game type that is already already very developed. It's been around. People are not begging for more of these.
Well, yeah,
It's like
and not even just extraction shooters, but also the entire like live service hero shooter is just
yeah,
is
yeah.
is 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 immolating as we speak. Not just with the aforementioned Concord, but it's just you see what happened with Rocksteady and Suicide Squad.
Hmm.
Literally studio killing titles at this point. It's
Yes.
bizarre.
Yep. And I think that the big problem is that because they're asking, gaming has often um, relied on you putting yourself into the game, that we sort of went overboard with early access, demanding everybody, not demanding, but luring everybody in with too much hype, and then we've almost reversed course to a certain degree, not in a good way, but just like learned all the wrong lessons from it, and then said, oh well, we don't even need to worry about the gamers. Like, how would the gamers perceive themselves? Studies show that while women may complain about attractive female characters in games, they overwhelmingly choose to play attractive characters rather than unattractive characters. If they're given an ugly woman and an attractive woman, they'll pick the attractive woman like 85% of the time, no matter what they have
Mm.
to say about it. And so, you know, I think that there's just sort of a lot of denial about what the medium is and what sort of agreements are normal, have come to be a given with with the medium,
Right.
so yeah.
And I think also my beef too with the early access stuff is I do not like the precedent set by Cyberpunk 2077. I'm sorry, I am not touching that title, even if it's all fixed, it's all put together. They took care of most of the bugs, they took care of most of this, that, and the other thing. It's like you do not deliver your homework that in shambles to your teacher. Why the hell would I put
Mhm.
up what 60, $70 for an unfinished buggy mess and wait, a year for it all to get, put back together the way it should have been at launch?
Mhm.
And instead, people just simply say, "Oh no, it's good now." And I'm sorry, we should not be rewarding sending in unfinished work to the market that way. I mean, any one of, I've seen independent devs get absolutely crucified for issues in like design and difficulty. There's this really, really talented guy in terms of design, Arjack, who made this FNAF fan game, Post Shift 2, that kind of became infamous for its ludicrous difficulty, this very bizarre, discombobulated set of mechanics. But the man was an incredible designer, but he was absolutely dogpiled. That title did not last like 8 hours on Game Jolt as a fan game for free, and yet we're out here rewarding studios for. I mean, it's good that they cleaned up their mess and made good on the people who did buy in, but at the
Mhm.
same time, it's like it shouldn't have been brought to market in that state to begin with. And so it's kind of this whole so it's kind of, between that and of course everyone kind of losing their minds about the price hikes with the Nintendo Switch 2 and the titles Nintendo are offering. It's kind of like, I think the problem is some of it might also be people masking one problem onto the other, thinking about how the failings of Western and technically Eastern in the case of a lot of Sony's stuff, the failures of the other two players, Microsoft and Sony, and then masking that onto Nintendo. Although Nintendo, track record wise, has been a little better. We'll have to give them credit for being a little better than what's been happening with the other two in the big three.
Well, I don't even know if I would say that. I want to say one thing about Cyberpunk, and I'll pivot into
Yeah,
to
go
the
for it. No, go for it.
Nintendo Switch and game prices and whatnot. And that is that, you know, this actually plays nicely with this point. One thing is that, again, Cyberpunk advertised itself as something different than what it ended up being. They literally changed the tags
Right, I
of the
remember
game
that.
after launch, not before launch, after launch. So you bought the game, you bought a game that said RPG or whatever, and then you look now and it says it's a shooter, and it's like, okay, whatever. But in Cyberpunk, there are, for example, I mean, don't get me wrong, you can go around. I've played the game because I got it for free with a graphics card, and it's kind of a fun world. It There's so many things that could have been better about it, but there are four companions: a a gay guy, a straight guy, a gay woman, and a straight woman. You know what I mean? So it's like, oh, here's your government mandated girlfriend, sir. You know, it's
Right,
uh,
right.
I don't know. And you compare that to games that were coming out 10 years, 15 years, in some cases, probably not 20 years earlier, but you know, that is such a stripped down experience to call it. I mean, I guess they scuttled out of calling it an RPG, but to even at any point up until launch think that they're going to describe this as an RPG with that kind of options for you. Um, it's very it's ridiculous, and Nintendo is like, I understand the price hikes. I object to a number of things, one of which going way back in our conversation to the fact that Nintendo has not been great about allowing preservation of
That is
their
true. That
games.
is
You
true.
know, they're very hostile towards that, and yet they don't really do a whole lot to actually make these things happen. And
It's a
now
miracle
they're
we got
going
GameCube
to
online. Yeah.
well, and now they're going to start charging people for the privilege of upgrading their Switch games just last generation to play on the Switch 2. You know, say what you will about Sony and Xbox, but broadly speaking, you pop a an old disc in. Certainly with the Xbox, I know I can feed in a 360 disc and play something. Um,
Right.
and it's uh, so there's a lot of different things going on there, but I will say I think that it makes sense that Nintendo is the first one over the hill on more expensive games, because in a lot of ways they've um, they've played a very different game than the other big giants of gaming, in a sense, and that partially goes back to their mentality about their hardware, which this is a translation, so I don't know what the original quote is, but it's essentially lateral thinking about established technology. So they call it like withered technology, if you want to look that up. But
Mm,
it's a sense that they are taking known quantities, understood processes, and then applying them to their products. And you can say, oh, well, that was their hardware strategy. But I think in a lot of ways, that was very much their game strategy as well. Uh, they have been very protective of their IP,
mm.
understandably. And what little R&D they have done in terms of research and development and whatnot, they're very silly about. You know, they just sued Pal World. How long has
Right,
it
right. I
been?
remember that.
You know, the Pokemon is the most valuable IP on the planet, but they haven't figured out how to make a competent Pokemon game in like 15 years, I think. It's remarkable. And then an indie comes out of nowhere.
I'm slowly rescinding my approval of Nintendo with each passing moment.
Well, it's ridiculous because in
No,
a
I
lot of
totally get it.
ways,
Yeah.
yeah, in a lot of ways, they've done more to uh, they haven't taken their golden geese and just cut their heads off. You know what I mean? Like Sony and Microsoft seem to have done, or bought up a bunch of other, fledgling golden geese and then thrown them into a blender and offered us a feather and meat smoothie and said, "We drink up," you know.
Right,
And so
right,
it's in a lot of ways they are more respectable in that regard, but they've made some huge missteps. And their attitude towards these things in terms of trying to address the fact that they haven't made a really good Pokemon game in eons is
right,
they're leveraging their patents and IP rights to attack competitors. And this is a normal in a lot of ways. This is a normal behavior that I see from my world of engineering out in the oil field. It's good to have the best tool in a industry, and it's relatively the real strength is if you develop something that lets, for example, in my line of work, a drilling rig get it resources that nobody else is able to get at without spending 5 times as much money, then immediately the race becomes, well, let's get that onto those applications as quickly as possible. And everybody else looks around and says, how can we get around their patents? And the goal becomes, how do you make it as painful as possible to avoid licensing our products? You know what I mean? Licensing our IP. And so I think that Nintendo has this mentality that they're going to be able to bring they're going to be able to bring the market to them to a certain degree. And I mean, they're right. They have been right so far. I don't think that's going to last forever, but it makes sense. Basically, what I'm bringing back around. This is why it makes sense to me that Nintendo is the one who's willing to go over the hill and say, yes, give us $90 for a game and whatnot, because they've also been the ones who've been saying, yes, give me $60 full price for a 20-year-old game, you know.
right, right.
And if anybody else had done that, if Microsoft was out here charging $60 for Halo 1 and trying to charge, like $180 for the first three Halos remastered or something, everybody would, you know, they would die of dehydration from spitting on them. And
Right. No,
it,
absolutely. And
it's
and it's and the
lunacy.
and then on the absolute flip side, Unreal stopped selling the original Unreal, but they just let a freaking ISO of it sit on Internet Archive and say, "Yep, no, if you want to run it, it's there on Internet Archive. Go play." And I'm I'm like, "Good grief!"
I
It's
mean,
like almost
Daggerfall
the
was free,
right, right.
and so it's a complicated point, but I think that uh, the one thing, but to kind of bring this back to another thing is that Nintendo does at least understand telegraphing expectations,
Oh,
and that
100%.
is where
100%.
that is where I think it's almost like you could do everything else wrong. You could do all these other things that would get everybody else crucified, but because they understand the promise that they're making to their audience for the most part, and they endeavor to actually maintain that promise, it has done just a huge amount. It's like, almost any port and storm kind of thing. um it shows how forgiving the consumers are willing to be if you maintain your promises. And that's why my personal prediction with like Switch 2 and games and all this other stuff, I think that after people kind of grumble about it for a couple of months, they might have a slow launch for Switch 2. But I think a year later, if they provide games that really hit those key points and provide the experiences that they're promising to gamers, and they're actually experiences anybody wants, conversely to like
Right.
Marathon, it's everybody will pull out the $80, $90 and say, thank you, sir. May I have another?
And the thing also is too, because even if the actual titles themselves have suffered, like for instance Pokemon, the other thing they've been very good, and this goes to the telegraphing thing, is simply that preservation of their character's image. Like everyone, obviously, new Mario Kart, everyone's like, okay. I have seen people obscenely hyped for the new Kirby Air Riders title. One, because it's Sakurai, out of the Smash Brothers minds. You know, you know, it's
Hmm.
it's like I think I think Sakurai to Smash is like what Raven is to like COD. Incredible talent stuck on this one title. Although that might be a little cruel
Yeah.
in terms of just because the quality of Smash overall has been pretty consistent from what although just from a player standpoint, from someone who's like, hey, you want to play Smash? Sure, what the hell, why not? But like they have been
Yeah.
very good about preserving the image and intent of their characters by and large. It's the reason why we haven't seen
Yeah.
a Mario Brothers adaptation until 2 years ago, where literally it was Nintendo hovering over the shoulders of Illumination and their creative team, making sure that everything looks, sounds, smells right as far as the Mario Brothers IP is concerned. And so on the flip side, it's been able to preserve creatively the image of these characters, but on the other hand, it's that obsessive, I think the story goes is that they had actually lost rights to something early on in like the 1980s, and it basically created this company wide like shell shock about copyright holding. So they're not only on top of, keeping things registered, but they are like obsessive compulsive protective of their
Hmm.
intellectual property. But the other issue too is the fact that next generation might not be much of a console war to begin with, because one, no matter who says anything, the PS5 did not get a hot start, and it's second place basically by default, because of the fact that one, you do have a couple of decent titles that do hit it big, like an Astrobot and what have you, and you have a couple of slowly but surely the exclusives start rolling in. But because of all the issues with supply, with COVID, with everything, the on the West, on both PS5 and Xbox, they did not get a hot start. Nintendo technically got them because they got the Switch out before the end of the decade.
Yeah.
And then on top of that,
Yeah.
it's been almost this clown car crash at Microsoft where they seem to not even want to be in the console game anymore. Like the way they've been talking about, Xbox will be everywhere. One, they're no longer, I believe they're no longer doing exclusivity for, I think the announcement was that Halo was no longer an Xbox exclusive. It could foreseeably be on
Yeah.
like the next PlayStation and what have you. But the way they've been talking, you're almost wondering, dear God, are they good? Is the next Xbox going to be like Google Stadia? Like, is the next Xbox not even going to be a box? It's just going to be going
Yeah.
off into literally the ether. So it's almost like
Yeah.
Nintendo isn't even just in a position where, they have enough of the creative vision of their titles is still assured enough that it's not like, we haven't seen the corruption of Donkey Kong. People are. Do I say people are gonna go ape or not? Anyway, we're gonna leave that pun on the
Yeah.
table. The point is, a lot of these titles, people are going absolutely bonkers for it. They love seeing the new Donkey Kong. They love seeing the new Kirby Air Ride. The fact that Kirby Air Ride is getting a sequel, 20 something years on, is I think is absolutely grabbing a lot of people. And the way people are talking about Mario
Yeah.
Kart as a launch title and also packed in with Switch 2 for that bundle, which remind you is
Hmm.
packed in, but their literal demo is not. It's being sold for $10. That is just obscene. Merry Christmas, kids. We're selling you demos now. Good God. Anyway,
Yep.
but it's like
Yep.
literally, it's Sony is just gonna keep trudging on, and whatever the PS6 is, it'll just be like the second place by default, because Xbox, through a
Hmm.
combination of the bad PR and the constant pivoting away from this constant, mixed messaging about, is the Xbox even going to be a box anymore? Is it even going to exist as a console? It's like
Yeah.
Nintendo isn't even
Yeah.
just in a position where it's just banking on the assuredness of the creative vision. There is very little competition to be seen at the triple A level in terms of the console market. The next generation might literally just be Switch 2, PS6, and Xbox finally implodes, or it comes in this shape of like a Blu-ray player. Like, who knows?
Yeah. Well, and I think another factor that is getting that's starting to influence some of the quote unquote next gen thinking and whatnot is I think that there were some I don't know, maybe this is giving people too much credit at the tippy top of like Microsoft or whatever. I think that there is at least some contingent at Microsoft that is just expecting to be able to buy Steam at sooner or later, you know? And once that happens, it's going to be, uh, shall we say, a tragic historical events analogy for gamers,
Right.
and
I can't imagine what
like,
event you might be referring to, Richard.
yeah, it's going to be
What
it's not going to be
was it?
good.
The what was it the raid on Fort Sumter in 1861?
No, but yeah, that's it. Yeah, but right now, I mean, in a lot of ways, Steam is already positioning themselves sort of as a silent fourth console with the Steam Deck.
Right, right,
They've been goofing around. They goofed around with the Steam Link. I actually bought one of those, which is the direction that maybe Microsoft thinks they're going to go in. They've tried controllers. They did the VR applications and everything else, but the Steam Deck is the thing that seems to be lingering and getting second and I believe third generations. So, it's currently still in this sort of like awkward little phase, and of course it's Linux, so it's different world than
right,
Microsoft
right,
and to some degree, but they've invested a huge amount of tech capital in basically producing smooth and low cost in terms of processing power emulation of Windows on Linux. And so, like the tech side has them poised to like. I wouldn't be surprised if next generation there's not a black like a dark horse candidate here of Steam suddenly gamers rise up
right,
and
right.
doing something out of left field. But
Wh-
anyway, that's all way off in
No,
the future. I don't know what to say
I,
about
I
that.
I think it's possible. I would also think it'd be hilarious if like GOG came out with like a retro all-in-one, like all those like plug and play titles that have been licensed to like third-party manufacturers, like the what they've done, the NES Mini, the SNES Mini, stuff like that.
Hmm. Well, another thing that's interesting and somewhat shameful for gaming as a whole is that you can the best way if you want to emulate uh, old games, especially older Nintendo games, is to buy an illegal copy of them on one of the little pseudo Game Boys off of whatever. Name your favorite Chinese knockoff website, Temu or AliExpress or whatever, and I think that actually has had a big impact on some of the console market because certainly reselling old titles console market because you can get something that's the size of a mass market paperback book that can run everything up till Xbox 360 practically with a faithfully recreating these things, and you can buy it with uh, you know 5,000 games or whatever on it. Now a lot of them are trash that you don't want, but it'll have all the big hits from those console eras on it. And I mean, I don't love. Obviously, I strongly support the creators actually getting this stuff, but as it stands, there's really no avenue that if you were to try and buy these things, first of all, you're buying it from somebody who bought the rights 10 years ago and then decided to throw it in a dumpster. So it's there's not really a good ethical path forward on some of these things. And so it's anyway, it's wild that illegal Chinese knockoffs are like an actual good option and a real contender whenever you're having a discussion about retro consoles or any kind of console based gaming.
I heard Soldier Boy's gonna make a fortune on those.
Yeah, I know.
Oh my god.
The trick is that you got to be in China so that there's nothing bad can
Right,
happen to you.
exactly. Oh my
Uh,
gosh. It is very strange too, especially because, well, one, obviously it's the fact that the file sizes on these things are tiny, tiny, ridiculously
yes.
small on a lot of retro titles. So I mean, it's gotten to the point where literally there are sites that are emulating in browser. Like not even just go here,
Hmm.
download the ROM, then go here, download this emulator. No, literally there are just sites now that'll just play them like flash games, which is utterly insane to me. Like you can even configure controls and everything and just play it in browser. I mean, maybe put your VPN on just so the Nintendo police don't no knock raid your house. But for real though, it is literally just playable in browser. It is so insane to even think about that. And it sucks too
Yeah.
because the issue too is that when things are aftermarket, things are aftermarket. There is no back royalty rate being paid from the guy who's selling you his old,
Yeah.
collection of Genesis games. None of that's going back to Sega. His legal tender was sent there decades ago. Right now, it's just he's making a couple of bucks, selling you a couple of cartridges and like a $50 console. God willing, it's ever that cheap. You know. Although if it's that
Yeah.
cheap nowadays, there's probably something severely wrong with it that you might have to get the old soldering iron out on. But basically, it's like the issue too is the simple fact that once games are in the aftermarket, there is no like royalty rate. If it's simply an issue about the creators getting paid, it's one of those things where it's just they already got paid. Those initial retail sales,
Yeah.
that's it, Jack. That's all she wrote. Beyond digital sales on a storefront, whether on
Hmm.
the console itself, like with what Nintendo's been doing with their stores, or through something like Steam, where they have the like I mentioned earlier in the show, the Sega Genesis Mega Drive collection, where you can literally buy titles for like $2 a shot, on top of having the in-house, essentially the emulator there with all their neat little like 90s bedroom design that they have for their UI. So it's like beyond those though, there are certain titles that have not been brought on there because I bought the actual one shot
Hmm.
off eBay, but Shakan the Forever Man. That's not in any of these collections. There are a bunch of titles that are just nowhere to be found. Like, I don't think Castlevania Bloodlines was the Sega Genesis title for that series, correct?
I didn't. I don't know
Fair enough.
honestly. That's a little too
Well,
far back, too retro in my
fair,
knowledge.
fair enough. But point there though is that titles like that are just not included. Like obviously all the famous ones, Altered Beast is there, but I think
Hmm.
Alex Kidd is in there. Just a bunch of different titles are in there. And of course, the moment I say Altered Beast, the first thing that comes into my mind is "Wise from your grave." First thing anytime I say it. Oh my god. But it's like there are a bunch of these other titles that are just nowhere to be found. And so it's like if you have no my rule with piracy has always been if I have no legal means of seeing this, or at the very least, someone else hasn't done the dirty work of, uploading it somewhere else like OK.ru. If you want to watch a movie you can't find anywhere on streaming, or, basically, as shady as it sounds, anything that doesn't involve me getting my hands dirty. It's like, use that. But if it's like, like my go-to line is if I'm looking for rare Latvian animation, well, sorry, Charlie, I'm gonna have to go hunting wherever the hell I can find that. It's just there is nowhere else to go when you have a title that isn't being sold by the rights holder, isn't available on the aftermarket, or at least for a reasonable price. Then again, the retro
Yeah.
market's been completely messed with. It's literally if there's no viable alternative, I'm not surprised that people go in and sail the seven seas of for whatever they're looking for. Honestly, and it's
Hmm.
also
Hmm.
a shame too, because this can kind of to go back to what we were talking about with sort of the idea of the over designing or under designing. A lot of these retro titles, the great thing about them is that the storytelling is often in the design. Kind of going back to your point too, as well, about how it seems almost older titles seem almost inversely interested in story compared to what's happening now. In that there are these. It's again, it's the subtleties. It's what's happening in the environment. It's what's happening in the sound design. I mentioned in I mentioned Unreal earlier, and one of the things that always bowls me over is sort of the narrative at play of the Nolly and the Scarge, and kind of the one, obviously the contrast in design, but two, the atmosphere of the environments. Because I think I think the old tagline was, it's called Unreal because it is. And when you step out into that, into that green field with the mountains and everything, it's like, man, this must have hit like crack in '98. And then on top of that, to have this almost, almost Saturday morning cartoon esque kind of, alien situation here, not in terms of design, but in terms of the idea of good versus evil, the hard moral binary there. The Scarred are obviously the evil ones, the Nali are obviously the good ones that are helping you along in defeating them, as you're essentially there, taken as the prophet, taken as the prophesied savior of their people. And because it's done with such color, because it's done with such great music and such great level design, it's like you feel like you're not just being spun, albeit a slight compared to other titles, but still spun a story nonetheless. You feel like you're really living in it, and you're
Hmm.
there. You're always there. And I see that even in like pixel art titles. Like I mentioned Castlevania, that's one of the reasons why Symphony of the Night has endured. There is few
Yeah.
games that look that good. My god, that film looks
Well,
divine.
yeah, I was talking with somebody, and I think that the everybody is like, stop doing pixel art, or whatever. And I get it. I get it. There's 10 million uh, pixel art indie games, but the deal with pixel art and really with game art in general is that whereas with I mean, you have the same problem with movies, I suppose, whenever it comes to something like CG or bad practical effects, and even that's why bad practical effects are almost always better than bad CGI. Is that you need to have a consistent world. And with pixel art, at least, it's much easier to have a consistent visual narrative going on. And, uh, I think that that's why a lot of these games age well, especially the ones that lean into the limitations of their graphics. And why you see so much is not even nostalgia because a lot of these people never played these games. But why you see an appreciation for certain um, overall aesthetic styles that remain long after the graphical need for such a thing. The computing power has vastly exceeded any place where the limitations really need to be considered.
No, 100%. My belief has always been, and it's been this way across almost every medium, whether it's comics, whether it's movies, whether it's games, is that I will take a defined style over kind of a generic realism any day. And what's so great about diving back into these retro titles through, services like GOG, which, by the way, going to the privacy thing, not only are they doing their damnedest to preserve a lot of these
Mhm.
titles, but they're also doing a damn fine job of making them affordable. But on top of that, DRM free. So you don't even have to deal with the issues of Steam, essentially buying licenses for games rather than actually buying the game outright. No, you own the titles you get out of
Yeah.
GOG. But the great thing I've found in being able to buy these titles and being able to explore them and experience them is that even in their limitations, some of these just have an atmosphere to die for. Whether it's this very
Mhm.
cool, I go back to the Saturday morning cartoon thing, but in this case, I genuinely will say these look like they could have been Sat AM cartoons from the 90s. The character design work on something like a Strife, or going back to LucasArts Outlaws, which was their Western shoot 'em up game. Not shoot
Mhm.
'em up because that implies 2D. This is first person shooter. There. See, I'm still learning.
Yeah.
Do not crucify me. But point is, now they're both have these incredibly unique styles, aided by exemplary voice acting. Especially in the case of Outlaws, where they were
Mhm.
getting actors like Richard Mall, John Delancey, just incredible voice talent. And you get lost in this world. You get lost in the escapism. You get lost in the fantasies of these titles. And then on the flip side, you go back to something like I mentioned earlier in the show, Blade Runner. I could live in that game. I love the backgrounds, I love the atmosphere, the sound design, and it's not particularly realistic. The models haven't aged well. You can see some of that early motion capture jank. But at the end of the day, what counts is, did I have fun and am I invested? And if those two combine to
Mhm.
create an experience I won't soon forget, that's worth that's worth billions more than, can it run Crisis.